Besides working on the library, I found also an interest in comparing different projects by Asplund. And one of the aspects that I found interesting to investigate was color. And this was a topic that had been a little bit overlooked in the Asplund literature. And in an earlier paper, which I presented 2 years ago, and which is available in proceedings from that symposium, which Patrick organized, I compared the library with the Lister County Courthouse and in Sölvesborg and the Skandia Cinema here in Stockholm, to see if there was some sort of mutual use of color during the 1920s in Asplund's work. And the characteristics that I found may be summarized in 3 sentences, actually. First, by using similar colors indoors and outdoors, Asplund enhanced the sense of exterior also in the interior. And we could find that at Skandia Cinema here earlier, because there were a 2-layered facade originally, and Asplund used the same color on both these layers, a little bit the same way as he does in the library later on. And second, in systematically using complementary colors, important relationships between different interiors were clarified in an informative way. And we have that here as well in the Skandia Cinema. First you enter the ambulatory, which is covered in green stucco, and then you enter the theater itself, which is covered in red velvet. And these 2 colors actually are complementary colors. And there are evidence in the archive also that this was intentional. So it's not just that they represent something, these colors, they're actually used to be complementary and contrasting, to make it clear for the visitor that you're entering from one space into another. And third, by using color as a mere background, primary aspects could be highlighted, or secondary aspects or even mistakes could be hidden. And we have that here in the theater as well, because below these exquisite textile galleries, we have a red velvet cladding, which goes both over the walls and the doors as well. We don't actually see the doors, and they have not been articulated in a very interesting way. In this presentation, I will put most emphasis on the Stockholm Public Library, and especially what I would call the colors of knowledge. In his design for the library, Asplund constructed a veritable rite of passage in which the visitor is guided not just by the actual relationships, but also by color, light, and sound, as Patrick also pointed out earlier. And the different spaces are juxtaposed to each other in a complementary way. This has only been acknowledged in survey books on Asplund, but I will try to show how colors were also intentionally used in the library for a special purpose, and that is to convey the distribution of knowledge itself. And we will travel to Denmark, as I promised before lunch. As a background, besides his well-known Tallinn journey, 1913-14, a distinct experience of color as a quality of its own did not present itself until summer 1918, when Gunnar Asplund and Gerda Selman spent their honeymoon in Denmark and visited the Thorvaldsen Museum. And the Thorvaldsen Museum was not just an inspiration to Asplund's use of color, first in the Skandia Cinema and later in his redesign of the public library. The museum was also the main monument of the early 19th century debate on architectural polychromy, and it serves here as a natural starting point for color investigation. You have the ambulatory around the courtyard and the photograph to the right. Completed in the revolutionary year of 1848 by architect Gottlieb Bindesbøll, the Thorvaldsen Museum exhibits a sensational use of color, both in the interior and the exterior. And the color scheme has been well preserved, although there were changes introduced in the interior already in the 19th century, as the fresco painted walls were repainted, for example, and the mosaic floors were removed. At the time of its completion, the use of color had political implications, representing bourgeois democracy, which is interesting to compare with a wider democratic Bergström at the end of the First World War, in which Asplund's visit took place. The museum also acted as a source of knowledge on antiquity itself, displaying the sculptures and collections of the Danish sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen. Although these neoclassical sculptures, as you can see in the right-hand photograph, belong to an earlier paradigm in which antique colors, as well as architecture, had been considered marble white, Thorvaldsen took an interest in the newly established knowledge of the colorful fragments found on antique remains. And this knowledge was summarized by the German architect Gottfried Semper in his well-known preliminary remarks, published in the Danish town of Altona, outside Hamburg, in 1834. On this title page here to the left, which you can see here, Semper quotes Goethe's Faust. Grey, dear friend, is all theory, and green the golden tree of life. In Goethe's color universe, different colors could represent different ways of thinking, and thus different kinds of knowledge, but that is not the use of color that I will emphasize here. Instead, Bindesbøll used color as a contrasting background, as you can see, to highlight Thorvaldsen's marble sculpture and also his plaster casts in much the same way as Semper introduced earlier in a display of Thorvaldsen's sculpture in Altona. And that was already in 1834, and it's a connection here between this pamphlet and the display that he made at the same time. Besides the contrasting background effect, which enhances the sculpture, the knowledge of color in antiquity itself was also conveyed in a very intricate and paradoxical way. So it doesn't impose these colors on the sculptures themselves, but actually show the colorful antiquity behind the sculptures instead. This photograph overlooking the museum courtyard from the second floor corresponds with a black and white snapshot found in Asplund's collection at Arctes, taken on a rainy day, part included on the left side of this slide. So it's the black and white part to the left. At the time of Asplund's visit, the facades were weathered by years of decay, and the courtyard colors had faded much the same way as in this photograph that I took 2 years ago. This weathered condition was favored by Carl Petersen, the architect in charge of the building at that time, and who dismissed proposals for a reconstruction. Thus, the courtyard was not fully renovated in 1934, while the exterior facades were completed first in 1959. So what Asplund actually saw was facade in decay and this little bit faded colors. But as you can see from Asplund's part of the slide, some work had actually begun, with the moldings being recently highlighted in white to the upper left there. And this is exactly what Asplund directed the camera towards that angle. So he was obviously interested in the way that the rendering was going to be restored at the time. An important aspect of the Thorvaldsen facades is that they are finished and were finished with a color rendering, not just with a layer of paint. And from that point of view, the colors of the facades, as well as the interior walls, originally had a materiality of their own, distinct from a painted rendering, which was much more common, especially in Sweden at that time. And this was only one of the lessons that Asplund learned from his visit to Copenhagen and later made use of in the necessary redesign of the library in Stockholm. As we can see from this photograph from the Arctes collection taken by Carl Gustav Rosenberg, a favored photographer by Swedish architects at the time, at the completion of the library in spring 1928, Asplund also made use of other more precise formal attributes, such as the portals, of course. And these portals were designed in late 1925, when construction work had been ongoing for almost a year. The reason for delay was, as Anna Bortolozzi pointed out this morning, that the bids for the main contract a year earlier had been far too high for the budget, and that the contract had been signed omitting all kinds of costly materials, such as natural stone or stucco work, let alone floors and bookshelves. During 1925, Asplund was forced to redesign both exterior and interior, to meet the demands of the contractor and the commissioner. In doing so, he found a helping hand in the master plasterer Augusto Conte, who also worked actually before that in the Skandia Seminar. So we have stucco works by Conte and his assistants here as well. And Conte accepted to treat the main public interiors as well as the facades with a cheaper version of stucco, made of a fine lime mortar and mixed with pigment. The proposed material was tested and found as durable as a standard painted rendering. But in the end, the workers' union was not happy with this development, and they set the price as high per square meter that Conte had to redraw his contract. And it was not just 100%, it was about 500% higher, because they were afraid that this new material would sort of affect their possibilities of getting work in the future. So those aspects could also sort of hamper the process. For this reason, the facades were completed in autumn 1926 with a cheaper version of stucco on the lower parts up to the decorative moldings, and with a standard painted rendering on the upper parts. And contemporary and later photographs show a visible difference in color, but as there are no evidence that supports the intention behind this difference, it's difficult to know if it was according to the original plan or just a reason of the process itself. So that is one aspect which makes it a little bit difficult to know exactly what the intentions were here. If we continue in the main axis, the colors of the library has been best preserved in the main entrance, starting in the vestibule with its black stucco walls and ceiling and its original buff-colored rendering on the outer wall of the rotunda, corresponding with the color of the exterior in the way that this is actually the same wall that continues on top up to the exterior. So it's only a thin roof layer between the curved staircase here and the open sky. The reason for choosing the same cheaper version of stucco both on the outside and the inside here was, of course, that the vestibule should be interpreted as outdoors in the same way as here at the Skandia originally. By repeating the portal, Asplund also pointed out that the outer wall of a rotunda was in fact a part of the facade. Thus, the color of the exterior was connected with the interior and cannot be reduced just to a question of townscape. It was also part of the interior color scheme. Entering the rotunda, its present state with the off-white color of the walls and ceiling more or less correspond to the original lime wash. The reading rooms on each side of the rotunda, however, as Andreas and Anna showed us this morning, had originally a more colorful and intimate character. The reason may be drawn from the official report published in the Library Committee in spring 1922, which Marcelo also showed us this morning. In this report, Asplund analyzed the results of the American studies in connection with a proposal for the library. This program is easily summarized. Since common knowledge must be found in books, it must be the aim to supply the visitor or the citizens with the books they want in shorthand. The path to knowledge should thus be designed as the easiest way to find a certain book, without great effort or hesitation. A centrally planned building was the obvious answer to this program, as Asplund actually states, but color could also be helpful. The original colors of the reading rooms have as we saw before lunch, been preserved in the center and bookshelves of the north and south reading rooms. And I should say here that these colors tend to change between different screens and projectors. So the main issue here is not the exact color number, but the fact that they are actually complementary in the same way as we have here in Skandia. This complementary relationship between red and green, as used, the brick-colored rendering in the south reading room and the corresponding olive-colored rendering used in the north reading room, made it possible for the visitor also to choose and understand the relationship between these otherwise almost identical reading rooms. And especially in a circular building, it may be difficult to orientate yourself. You may find yourself in a wing which you think is actually on the other side. So this color scheme was actually quite informative. These colors were introduced at the same time as the head librarian presented the plan for organizing the books in the different reading rooms. And although the colors were not meant to represent the actual topics of the books, they helped the visitor to distinguish between North Reading Room, South Reading Room, and the books that were situated there. The North Reading Room was used for the humanities section, and the South Reading Room was used for the social and natural sciences. And, in fact, the color scheme was used for books themselves, bound in different colored cloths. And you see them to the right here, to the left here in this slide. For the fiction in the rotunda, dark red cloth was used. I don't show it here. While the adjacent reading rooms for non-fiction made use of either dark blue or green cloth. And these books have actually survived, and they were still bound in these colors in the 1970s. And these are actually two books taken from the shelf. So they still exist, although they are now in minority. The color mix secured a certain contrast in relation to the general color scheme of the reading rooms. So they were mixed green and blue. And one of the reasons for this was that you couldn't foresee the exact development of these topics or sections or areas within the library as the collection grew and developed in different ways. As a result, the colors of the books could be used without difficulty over a quite long period of time. So they could actually be a little bit redistributed as long as they didn't end up in the rotunda, for instance. In the 1970s, 80s, the gaudy dust jackets of the book market replaced the original coherent impression. But as I mentioned, you could still find some items bound in this way, both on the shelves and especially in the storeroom. As stated in the minutes of the building committee, however, the reading rooms were painted white. And we discussed this already before lunch this morning. And the white color, which is the word which is used in the minutes, was actually off-white. And this layer of paint is well preserved in both the south and north reading rooms. So it's no problem to find the exact color or the exact color material. I should also say that the original color material beneath that layer of paint is also mostly more or less preserved everywhere on these surfaces. So there is really no mistakes to be made about this. There are very few layers of paint on these reading room walls, and one of the reasons for that is that the library staff didn't want to close the library very often. So they certainly didn't want to evacuate the books. And this is why when the repainting was made in 1935, that the bookshelves were only covered. The books were not evacuated. So the original color scheme was preserved in all the book niches, but today, as we saw earlier, they only exist in the back niches of these reading rooms. This color was also preserved in the entrance niche and in the window niche, which you can see the middle part of this photograph taken in the late 1930s. As I mentioned earlier this morning, I could also confirm that Asplund was involved in this change. And the reason for that is that this was a part of the new reading room, the new West Wing project. That was constructed in 1932, but in the program for that building, these rooms and the repainting of these rooms are included as well. So there was only a short delay of about 2.5 years because of practical and economic reasons. So it was exactly the same scheme, and also the lighting scheme changed in both these, or all these 3 reading rooms. And the original lighting scheme was replaced by these reflectors, these upright reflectors. And in the reading rooms, they are referred to as size reflectors, while in the new wing, they're called, I think, Sterling reflectors. So they may have been bought from different firms, but they look more or less the same on photographs. So the same lighting scheme was used as well. Finally, in this photograph from the City Archives, probably taken in the 1940s, we can see the result of the new ideals in the new wing, which was open to the public already in 1933, so about 2.5 years before repainting of the 2 original reading rooms. And from the photographs, it seems to have blended seamlessly with modern life and stayed in tune with the purpose of the library for decades. This change was not just the result of new aesthetics or practical considerations, although I would not deny their impact of the result, but it was also the result of a different view of knowledge, which had more in common with 18th century Enlightenment than the early project had implicated. And from a library perspective, this change strengthened perhaps the symbolic access to knowledge, compared with a more colorful and probably also more informative view of knowledge that characterized the original design. It also contributed to keep the building alive for future generations, and it was not until the advent of computers that an alternative vision of knowledge was introduced, and it happened to coincide with the renovation work that took place around 1980. Although we might have wanted the building preserved to its original state, and would have liked to acknowledge that, we may also acknowledge that some changes took place, at least for practical reasons, and especially as we would never be able to introduce them, of course, in a later perspective today. But that said, I believe that the library will in the future probably be subject to more thorough reconstruction or conservation work in order to live up to its heritage value. But that would be probably connected with the development of the library organization per se, and of course with the issues of economy or as well as political considerations. Thank you very much, and thank you again for the invitation.